Dust clung to her throat the day they traded her for a debt. 19, holding a burlap sack of meager belongings, sold to a feral mountain man with 5 wild children. The town gave her a week before she'd break. They were wrong. What she did broke them instead. $74.12. That was the exact price of Josephine's life. She saw it written in the ledger at Miller's Mercantile. The blue ink smeared where her father's sweaty thumb had pressed against the page. Her father didn't look at her when he shook Gideon Hayes's hand. He just stared at the sawdust on the floorboards, reeking of cheap rye whiskey and weeks of unwashed fear. Gideon stood a full head taller than anyone else in the cramped store. He smelled of pine pitch, wet horsehair, and old wood smoke. His coat was buffalo hide, heavy and stiff with grease, and his beard was a tangled mess of dark brown that hid the lower half of a face weathered like old saddle leather. Josephine didn't cry. Crying was for girls who believed someone was coming to save them. She just gripped the twine handle of her single bag so hard her knuckles turned white. "She's strong enough," her father mumbled to the floor. "Knows how to cook, keeps her mouth shut, mostly." Gideon didn't say a word. He placed a heavy canvas pouch on the counter. The coins clinked a dull, heavy sound that settled deep in Josephine's stomach. He turned his head, fixing his pale, slate-gray eyes on her. They weren't unkind, but they were utterly hollow. He gave a sharp nod toward the door. The walk to the wagon felt like a funeral procession. The town of Oakhaven watched through dirty glass windows and from the shaded porches of the assay office. Josephine felt their stares like physical weight. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, offered a look of cloying pity that made Josephine want to spit in the dirt. The men outside the saloon nudged each other, placing quiet, cynical bets on how many days she'd last up on the ridge before running back down, frostbitten and insane. She climbed up onto the buckboard without waiting for Gideon to offer a hand. The wood was splintered and cold against her thighs. Gideon swung up beside her, the wagon groaning under his bulk, and cracked the reins over the backs of 2 massive, shaggy draft horses. They left town without a single backward glance. The climb into the Bitterroot Mountains took 5 hours. The silence between them was an absolute, heavy thing, broken only by the rhythmic squeal of the wagon axle and the hollow thud of hooves on packed dirt. As they climbed higher, the air grew thin and sharp, biting at the exposed skin of Josephine's neck. The pines closed in, towering lodgepoles that blocked out the late afternoon sun, casting long, bruised shadows across the trail. She studied Gideon out of the corner of her eye. His hands on the reins were massive, the knuckles scarred and thick with calluses. He didn't look like a man looking for a wife. He looked like a man who needed a beast of burden. "They're feral," Gideon said suddenly. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding in a riverbed. Josephine jumped slightly. "Excuse me?" "The children," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Their mother died a year ago, winter fever. I work the timber lines. They've been raising themselves. They won't make it easy on you." "I didn't expect them to," Josephine replied, her voice flatter than she felt. "Don't try to mother them," he added. "Just keep them fed. Keep them from burning the cabin down." "I'm not a mother," she said bitterly. "I'm a ledger entry." Gideon's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering under his beard. But he didn't argue. He just urged the horses faster up the steep grade. They broke through the tree line just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and bleeding orange. The cabin sat in a clearing, a sturdy, squat structure of peeled logs chinked with mud. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. Before the wagon even rolled to a complete stop, the door banged open. Josephine's breath hitched. 5 children stood on the porch. The oldest, a boy of about 12, held a heavy Winchester rifle resting casually over his forearm. His face was smeared with soot, his hair a matted nest of blonde dirt. Beside him stood a girl of 9 holding a thick stick like a club, her dress torn at the hem and stained with blackberry juice. 2 smaller boys peeked out from behind her legs, and on the floorboards, a toddler in a soiled linen shift was gnawing on a piece of raw firewood. They looked like a pack of wolves cornered in a den. "Put the gun down, Thomas," Gideon said, his voice carrying no heat, just exhaustion. The boy, Thomas, glared at Josephine. His eyes were the same slate gray as his father's, but burning with a fierce, hot hatred. "Who's she?" "She's going to cook and keep the fire," Gideon said, stepping down from the wagon. "Her name is Josephine." "We don't need her," Thomas spat. "Put the gun inside," Gideon repeated, stepping toward the porch. The sheer size of him ended the argument. Thomas scowled, lowering the barrel, and vanished into the dark interior of the cabin. Josephine grabbed her bag and climbed down. Her legs were numb from the cold and the rattling ride. As she walked toward the porch, the 9-year-old girl stepped squarely in her path. She smelled strongly of unwashed hair and wild onions. "You aren't our ma," the girl hissed. "I don't want to be," Josephine said, brushing past her. "I just want to get inside before I freeze to death." She stepped over the threshold, and the smell hit her like a physical blow. The cabin reeked of rancid bacon grease, wet wool, stale urine, and confined bodies. The floor was packed earth, littered with dirty tin plates, half-chewed bones, and scattered kindling. It was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. Josephine stood in the center of the room, her cheap leather shoes sinking into the grime. She was 19 years old, $74 in debt, and standing in a cage of hostile strangers. Panic, cold and sharp, fluttered in her chest, begging her to drop the bag and run blindly back down the mountain. Instead, she set the bag on a sturdy wooden table. She unbuttoned her thin wool coat, folded it over a chair, and walked over to the hearth. She grabbed a heavy iron poker and shoved it into the embers, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. "Well," Josephine said to the dark room, "someone fetch me some water. We have a lot of scrubbing to do." The first 3 days were not a test of character. They were a brutal assault on her physical endurance. Gideon was gone before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. He'd leave a pile of split wood by the door and vanish into the timber lines, taking his silence and his massive, imposing shadow with him. That left Josephine alone with the pack. It began with the water. The creek was a quarter-mile down a steep, rocky incline behind the cabin. Hauling 2 wooden buckets up that hill tore at the muscles in Josephine's shoulders until they screamed. The wooden handles splintered her palms. The cold water sloshed against her shins, freezing her skirts to her legs. By noon of the second day, her hands were cracked and bleeding from the harsh lye soap. She scrubbed the tin plates with sand and boiled the filthy linens in a massive cast-iron cauldron over the fire. The cabin was a war zone of dirt. The children fought her at every turn. Martha, the 9-year-old, hid the matches. Samuel, 7, kicked mud across the floor the moment Josephine finished sweeping it with a stiff broom of bundled pine needles. Willa, a feral 4-year-old who communicated entirely in shrieks, bit Josephine's wrist when she tried to wash the child's face. But it was Thomas who waged a cold, calculating war. He didn't yell. He just undermined her. He would accidentally knock over a bucket of fresh water she had just hauled. He would casually toss damp wood into the fire so it smoked out the cabin, stinging their eyes. He watched her with a heavy, judgmental stare, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to pack her burlap sack and run. Josephine's internal contradiction gnawed at her. Part of her, the part that remembered the smell of fresh bread in town and a clean bed, hated them. She hated the sticky, snot-nosed toddler, Henry, who wailed endlessly. She hated the squalor. She hated her father for selling her to it. But deeper than the hatred was a stubborn, violent pride. The town of Oakhaven expected her to fail. Thomas expected her to fail. And Josephine would rather swallow broken glass than give them the satisfaction. On the evening of the 4th day, the tension snapped. She had spent 2 hours boiling salt, pork, and hard beans until they were barely edible. Her back ached so badly she felt physically sick. She served the food onto the tin plates and set them on the rough-hewn table. Thomas walked over, looked at his plate, and then looked at her. He didn't say a word, He just casually swept his arm across the table, knocking the plate to the floor. The beans splattered against the dirt. The tin clattered loudly in the silence of the cabin. Martha gasped. The younger ones froze. Thomas stood tall, puffing his chest out, trying to match his father's imposing stature. "Slop," he said. "My ma cooked better." Josephine stared at the spilled beans. The steam rose from the dirt. She didn't feel a sudden rush of maternal patience. She didn't feel an urge to nurture the grieving boy. She felt a hot, blinding flash of pure, unadulterated rage. She picked up her own heavy tin plate, walked calmly over to Thomas, and slammed it against the wall right next to his head. The loud clang echoed like a gunshot. Beans and pork grease exploded across the logs. Thomas flinched violently, stumbling backward over a chair and landing hard on the floor, his eyes wide with shock. Josephine stood over him, breathing heavily, smelling the salt and grease on her own hands. "Your ma is dead," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a low, ragged whisper that carried more menace than a scream. "And I am not her. I am tired, I am bleeding, and I am not putting up with a spoiled brat who thinks wasting food makes him a man." Thomas stared up at her, his chest heaving. For a second, she thought he might lunge at her. "You clean that up," Josephine pointed a shaking, cracked finger at the mess on the floor. "And you go hungry tonight. If you ever waste food I cooked again, you'll be sleeping in the barn with the horses." The heavy wooden door creaked open. Gideon stood in the frame. The cold wind rushed in, swirling the wood smoke around his massive boots. He held an axe in one hand, his face unreadable beneath the dirt and beard. He looked at the beans on the wall. He looked at Thomas on the floor. He looked at Josephine, whose chest was rising and falling in rapid, angry breaths. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Josephine waited for the blow. She waited for Gideon to drag her by the hair and throw her out into the snow. She had struck near his son. She had broken the peace. Gideon walked slowly into the room. He leaned his axe against the wall. He stepped over the spilled beans, pulled out his chair at the head of the table, and sat down. He pulled a clean plate toward himself and took a bite of the pork. He chewed slowly, swallowed. "Beans are hard," Gideon said, not looking at anyone. "Thomas, clean the floor." Thomas scrambled up, his face burning bright red, and grabbed a rag. Josephine's legs felt weak. She turned back to the stove, gripping the edge of the cast iron so tightly her palms burned. She didn't win a battle, she just survived a skirmish. But as she heard the wet scraping of Thomas cleaning the dirt floor behind her, the crushing weight in her chest eased by a fraction of an ounce. Later that night, the cabin finally fell quiet. The children were asleep in the loft, a tangle of limbs and ragged blankets. Josephine sat in a wooden chair near the dying fire, meticulously wrapping a piece of clean linen around her split knuckles. Gideon sat on a stool across the hearth, carving a notch into a piece of pine with a hunting knife. The sound of the blade biting into the wood was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. "He's angry," Gideon said quietly. The wood popped in the fire. "He's starving for discipline," Josephine replied, tying the knot with her teeth. Gideon paused his carving. He looked up, the orange light catching the deep lines around his eyes. "Town thought you wouldn't last the week." "The town is full of bored gossips who don't know anything about me," Josephine said. She leaned back, feeling the ache in her spine. "I didn't come up here to play house, Mr. Hayes. I came up here because my father drank away my dowry and sold me to clear a bar tab. I don't have anywhere else to go." Gideon stared at her. It wasn't an assessing look, like he was judging livestock. It was something heavier. He saw the grease stained into her dress, the exhaustion bruised under her eyes, and the defiant set of her jaw. "Gideon," he said softly. She blinked. "What?" "If you're staying," he said, returning the knife to the pine block. He stood up, towering in the low-ceilinged room, and walked toward the small side room where he slept. He stopped at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "You got grit, Josephine. Don't let them wear it out of you." He closed the door. Josephine sat alone in the dark, listening to the wind howl against the logs. She brought her bandaged hands up to her face, breathing in the smell of lye soap, wood smoke, and sweat. It wasn't a home. It was a prison made of mud and wood. But as she listened to the rhythmic breathing of the feral children above her, she realized one thing. She was the warden now. Frost crept up the inside of the window panes by late October, thick and white like cataracts on a blind eye. The mountain didn't just get cold, it turned actively hostile. The wind screamed through the valley, stripping the last yellow needles from the tamarack trees and rattling the heavy log walls of the cabin. Josephine learned to hate the cold. It was a physical presence, a heavy, aching thing that settled in the marrow of her bones and refused to leave. Her mornings began in absolute darkness. She would drag herself from the thin mattress in the corner, her breath pluming in the freezing air, to crack the crust of ice over the water bucket with the butt of an iron skillet. The hostility from the children hadn't vanished, but it had frozen into a wary truce. Survival took too much energy to leave room for spite. Martha stopped hiding the matches when she realized it meant shivering for an extra hour before the hearth threw heat. Samuel stopped kicking mud when the ground froze solid outside. But it was the sickness that finally broke the ice. It hit in mid-November. Gideon was 3 days deep in the high timber, trying to haul down enough cordwood to beat the first massive blizzard. Josephine was scraping the last bits of cornmeal from a barrel when she heard the cough. It came from the loft, a wet, tearing sound, like a rusted saw blade pulling through green wood. Josephine dropped the wooden spoon. She climbed the rough-hewn ladder, her knees popping in the quiet cabin. 4-year-old Willa was curled in a tight ball under a moth-eaten quilt. The child's skin was paper white, save for 2 burning red patches high on her cheeks. She was gasping, her tiny chest heaving as she fought for a sliver of air. Thomas knelt beside her, his bravado entirely stripped away. He looked exactly like what he was, a 12-year-old boy watching his sister drown in her own lungs. "She's burning up," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at Josephine, and for the first time, there was no defiance in his slate-gray eyes. There was only raw, naked terror. "It's what Ma got," the rattling. "It's what took Ma." Josephine didn't feel a sudden surge of maternal warmth. She felt cold, hard panic. If this child died while Gideon was gone, the fragile ecosystem of this cabin would shatter. "Bring her down to the fire," Josephine ordered. Her voice was flat, leaving no room for argument. "Now, Thomas." For the next 48 hours, the cabin became a sweatbox of desperation. Josephine dragged the heavy cast-iron cauldron over the hottest coals, filling it with water and fistfuls of sharp pine needles. She draped a heavy wool blanket over a chair, creating a suffocating tent, and forced Willa to sit inside it, breathing the scalding, resin-heavy steam. Willa fought. She thrashed and bit, clamping her small teeth down on the webbing between Josephine's thumb and forefinger until it bled. Josephine didn't yell. She just locked her arms around the child, ignoring the sharp pain, rocking her back and forth over the boiling water. "Breathe," Josephine muttered into the child's sweaty hair. "Just breathe, you little demon." Thomas stayed by her side the entire time. He hauled snow to melt for water. He kept the fire roaring so hot the chimney stones cracked. He watched Josephine with an unblinking intensity as she ground dried willow bark between 2 stones, mixing it with a tiny drop of honey to force down Willa's swollen throat. On the night of the second day, the howling wind outside masked the sound of the heavy door swinging open. Gideon stepped inside. He was covered in snow, his beard frozen into white spikes, smelling of wet horse and exhaustion. He stopped dead in his tracks. The cabin was stiflingly hot, smelling of camphor, pine, and stale vomit. Josephine sat in the wooden rocking chair by the hearth. Her hair had escaped its tight braid, hanging in greasy, damp strands around her face. Her dress was stained with sweat and soot. Willa was slumped against her chest, asleep. The awful, tearing rattle was gone, replaced by the smooth, deep rhythm of a sleeping child. Thomas was curled up on the rug at Josephine's feet, his head resting against the hem of her skirt, fast asleep. Gideon slowly pulled off his heavy gloves. The leather groaned in the quiet room. He walked over to the fire, the snow melting off his boots and hissing against the hot hearthstones. He looked at his son, sleeping peacefully against the woman he had hated. He looked at his daughter, breathing easily against her collarbone. Finally, he looked at Josephine. She was awake, staring back at him over Willa's head. Her eyes were bloodshot and bruised with exhaustion, but they were hard as flint. "She tried to stop breathing yesterday," Josephine whispered, her voice gravelly. "I wouldn't let her." Gideon didn't offer a dramatic speech of gratitude. He didn't drop to his knees. He simply reached out with one massive, calloused hand and gently brushed a damp strand of hair away from Josephine's cheek. His fingers were freezing cold, rough like sandstone, but the touch sent a sharp, electric jolt through her exhausted spine. "Go to sleep, Josephine," Gideon murmured, his voice a low, heavy rumble that settled deep in the room. "I have the watch." He carefully lifted Willa from her arms. As the physical weight of the child left her, a different kind of weight settled over Josephine. She looked at the man settling into the chair opposite her, cradling his daughter in his thick arms. She wasn't a ledger entry anymore. She was the only thing keeping the roof from caving in on them. And looking at Gideon, she realized he knew it too. April brought the mud. The mountain thawed in a chaotic mess of rushing brown water and sucking clay. They had survived. They were thinner, their clothes were ragged, and the cabin smelled permanently of wood smoke and damp wool. But nobody died. The flour barrel was entirely empty. The salt was gone. "We go to town tomorrow," Gideon announced one evening, sharpening his axe with a whetstone. The rhythmic shh filled the room. Josephine paused her mending. She looked down at her hands. The knuckles were permanently swollen, the skin rough and cross-hatched with tiny white scars from knife slips and lye soap. She wasn't the terrified 19-year-old girl who had ridden up the mountain 6 months ago. She felt heavier, denser, like the pine wood Gideon chopped. The wagon ride down into Oakhaven was vastly different from the ride up. Thomas sat in the back, his rifle casually resting across his knees, tossing chunks of dried mud at the trees. Gideon drove, silent as ever, but there was a comfortable space between them now. They didn't shrink away from each other on the buckboard. When the wagon hit a deep rut and Josephine's shoulder slammed into Gideon's arm, neither pulled away. She leaned into his solid mass, finding balance. Oakhaven looked exactly the same. It was a muddy smear of false front buildings and dirty boardwalks. But as the heavy draft horses pulled the wagon down the main street, the town stopped. Men on the porch of the saloon lowered their tobacco pipes. Women sweeping the boardwalks paused, leaning on their brooms. They were looking for a ghost. They expected Gideon Hayes to roll into town with a broken, hollow-eyed girl begging to be returned to her father. Or worse, they expected him to come back alone, claiming she ran off into the winter timber. Instead, Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Miller's Mercantile. He wrapped the reins around the brake, hopped down into the mud, and reached a hand up for Josephine. She took it. She stepped down, her heavy boots sinking into the muck. She wore a thick canvas coat Gideon had cut down to fit her, her hair tightly braided and pinned back. She didn't look at the boardwalk. She didn't look at Mrs. Gable, whose mouth was slightly open in shock. She walked straight up the wooden steps and pushed the heavy glass door of the Mercantile open. The bell jingled cheerfully. Mr. Miller was behind the counter, weighing nails. He looked up, his eyes widening. "Well, I'll be." "Josephine." 50 pounds of flour, Miller," Josephine said, her voice carrying a sharp, commanding edge that belonged on a mountain, not in a parlor. 10 pounds of salt, a gallon of molasses. "And I need 3 yards of the heavy blue canvas you keep in the back." The kids tore through their winter knees. Miller stood frozen. He looked past her to Gideon, who had just walked through the door. Gideon didn't say a word. He stood directly behind Josephine, his massive frame blocking the light from the window, crossing his arms over his chest. Miller stuttered, wiping his hands on his apron. Your father was just in here yesterday, Josie. He asked if, My name is Josephine, she cut him off, the tone of her voice dropping the temperature in the room. And I don't care what my father asked. He squared his debt 6 months ago. I have my own ledger now. The silence in the store was deafening. Mrs. Gable had slipped in through the front door, pretending to look at a display of pickled eggs, but her ears were practically vibrating. She's a tough one, Gideon, Miller tried to joke, laughing nervously. Must be giving you hell up there. Gideon stepped forward. He didn't smile. He placed a heavy, calloused hand squarely on the small of Josephine's back. It was a subtle movement, but in the crowded, tense space of the general store it was deafening. It wasn't a claim of ownership. It was a statement of solidarity. A wall of iron at her back. She runs the ridge, Gideon said, his gravelly voice echoing off the tin ceiling. Right up the flour. I'm paying in cash today. He dropped a heavy leather coin purse onto the counter. It hit the wood with the same dull thud Josephine remembered from 6 months ago. But this time, it didn't feel like a chain. It felt like an anchor. Miller scrambled to fill the order. Josephine stood at the counter, feeling the heavy, steady heat of Gideon's hand through her canvas coat. She turned her head slightly, catching Mrs. Gable staring. Josephine didn't look down. She locked eyes with the baker's wife and offered a slow, sharp, utterly cynical smile that sent the older woman scurrying out the door. 20 minutes later, the wagon was loaded. Thomas was already digging into a paper sack of horehound drops Gideon had tossed him. Josephine climbed up onto the buckboard. Gideon sat beside her, taking the reins. He looked at her, the corners of his eyes crinkling, just a fraction, under his thick beard. You terrified him, Gideon noted, nodding toward the store. He overcharges for salt, Josephine replied flatly, staring straight ahead at the muddy road leading out of town. Next time, check his scales. Gideon let out a short, rough sound, a rare, genuine laugh that rumbled deep in his chest. He snapped the reins. Hup! The horses strained, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the stunned silence of Oakhaven behind. The air grew thinner and sharper as they began the long climb back toward the timberline. Josephine leaned back against the wooden seat, breathing in the smell of wet canvas, pine pitch, and the heavy leather of Gideon's coat. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was dirt, blood, and freezing wind. But as she watched the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots rise up to meet them, she realized she didn't want to be anywhere else. She was exactly where she belonged. If you enjoyed this raw, grounded journey into the heart of the Wild West, hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a gritty, imperfect romance where actions speak louder than words. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next gripping tale of survival and unexpected love on the frontier. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you out on the trail.
Hi, my name is Fam Man, the owner and manager of Sunrise Ruthless Love. After watching the video, at 19, she was given to a mountain man with 5 children. What happened next shocked the entire town. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was watching Josephine slowly earn her place in a home that never welcomed her in the beginning. Nothing about her journey was easy, but she kept showing up with strength, honesty, and grit, even when nobody expected her to last. I think the story really shows how respect is built over time through actions, not words. Do you think Josephine changed the family, or did the family change her too? And if you were in her place, would you have stayed on that mountain after everything she went through? If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy grounded mountain stories like this, feel free to like and subscribe for more.